I thought I had it all: a beautiful home, the career everyone envied, a family who smiled in every photo. But behind the doors no one sees, everything was falling apart. Dreams that once felt like freedom turned into chains, and I finally realized that the life I built had a cost I wasn't prepared to pay. I always believed in the idea of dreams, not the fleeting kind, but the long, consuming dreams that take root in your chest and won't let go. For me, that dream was clear from the very beginning: a successful life that everyone around me would envy, a life that would feel untouchable. I worked tirelessly, day and night, convincing myself that every hour, every sacrifice was worth the price of success. But no one tells you what you trade in silence while you're chasing it. I remember the first real sign that something was wrong. My husband, Ryan, had been unusually quiet during dinner one night. He had always been the kind of man who carried his frustrations lightly, joking through them or sharing them with me. But that night, he barely touched his food. He just stared at the wall, hands clenched around his fork. I asked if he was okay, and he gave me that strained, polite smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. I should have pressed harder. I should have noticed the distance that had begun to grow. But I was too wrapped up in a big promotion I just landed at work, the one I thought would finally secure the life I wanted. And then it happened. The moment that would later make everything crystal clear. I came home from a late meeting, exhausted and buzzing with adrenaline from a deal I had finally closed. I stepped through the door and noticed the house felt different, quieter somehow, colder. That's when I found it: an envelope on the kitchen counter with my name written in Ryan's handwriting. My heart skipped, and a strange chill ran down my spine. I opened it, and inside was a notice of sale for our home. He had sold it while I was at the hospital for a minor surgery weeks before. Not only that, but he hadn't told me a word. I couldn't process it. My mind spun, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How could he sell our home without even mentioning it? Our life, our sanctuary, gone without a single conversation? And in that moment, I felt the first real crack in the illusion I had been living inside. This dream I thought I was building, it was fragile, too fragile to support the life I imagined. We argued that night, words spilling faster than I could contain them. Ryan's calmness turned icy, almost like he had rehearsed this conversation in his mind for weeks. He said it wasn't about me or us, it was about him, feeling trapped in a life that revolved around my ambitions, around my relentless pursuit of perfection. I laughed at first, bitterly, thinking it was absurd, but deep down, I knew he was right. I had allowed my work, my career, to become the axis around which our entire lives spun. I had promised myself that nothing would interfere with my dream, and in that promise, I had neglected the people who loved me most. The next few weeks were a blur of moving boxes, legal consultations, and sleepless nights. I realized that the more I achieved professionally, the more my personal life unraveled. Friends stopped calling. My sister, who used to drop by every week with her kids, suddenly didn't have time. Birthdays, holidays, moments that should have been joyful turned into logistical challenges I barely noticed, buried as I was under spreadsheets, deadlines, and corporate calls. It was as if the world around me had quietly started to dissolve, leaving only the shiny, polished shell of a life I thought I wanted. And yet, the worst was still coming. One evening, I received a message from my son's wife, a simple, innocuous text that made my stomach drop. "We got married last month. I hope you're okay with this." My son, my only child, had married without telling me, without even a conversation. I stared at my phone, numb, as though the world around me suddenly became unreal, as though I had been pushed out of a reality I had believed in for decades. When I confronted him, he said he didn't think I would approve, not with how distant I had been, not with how consumed I seemed about my work. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I wanted to vanish. But instead, I sat there quietly, absorbing the sting of truth. My pursuit of a dream had created an invisible wall between me and the people I loved. My ambition, the very thing I had believed would bring happiness, had isolated me, made me a stranger in my own home, in my own family. That night, I lay in the empty house, the silence pressing against me like a physical weight. I thought back to all the sacrifices I had made, the late nights, the missed anniversaries, the phone calls I didn't return, the small gestures of love that I had neglected. I realized that dreams have a cost, yes, but it is not just measured in hours or effort. It is measured in trust, in intimacy, in moments that slip by and can never be reclaimed. And in that quiet, painful reflection, I made a decision. I would continue to pursue my career, but I would no longer allow it to overshadow everything else. I would fight to reclaim my relationships, to be present, to show that the people I loved mattered more than any act. I thought I had it all. A beautiful home, the career everyone envied, a family who smiled in every photo. But behind the doors no one sees, everything was falling apart. Dreams that once felt like freedom turned into chains, and I finally realized that the life I built had a cost I wasn't prepared to pay. I always believed in the idea of dreams, not the fleeting kind, but the long, consuming dreams that take root in your chest and won't let go. For me, that dream was clear from the very beginning, a successful life that everyone around me would envy, a life that would feel untouchable. I worked tirelessly, day and night, convincing myself that every hour, every sacrifice was worth the price of success. But no one tells you what you trade in silence while you're chasing it. I remember the first real sign that something was wrong. My husband, Ryan, had been unusually quiet during dinner one night. He had always been the kind of man who carried his frustrations lightly, joking through them or sharing them with me. But that night, he barely touched his food. He just stared at the wall, hands clenched around his fork. I asked if he was okay, and he gave me that strained, polite smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. I should have pressed harder. I should have noticed the distance that had begun to grow. But I was too wrapped up in a big promotion I just landed at work, the one I thought would finally secure the life I wanted. And then it happened. The moment that would later make everything crystal clear. I came home from a late meeting, exhausted and buzzing with adrenaline from a deal I had finally closed. I stepped through the door and noticed the house felt different, quieter somehow, colder. That's when I found it, an envelope on the kitchen counter with my name written in Ryan's handwriting. My heart skipped, and a strange chill ran down my spine. I opened it, and inside was a notice of sale for our home. He had sold it while I was at the hospital for a minor surgery weeks before. Not only that, but he hadn't told me a word. I couldn't process it. My mind spun, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How could he sell our home without even mentioning it? Our life, our sanctuary, gone without a single conversation? And in that moment, I felt the first real crack in the illusion I had been living inside. This dream I thought I was building, it was fragile, too fragile to support the life I imagined. We argued that night, words spilling faster than I could contain them. Ryan's calmness turned icy, almost like he had rehearsed this conversation in his mind for weeks. He said it wasn't about me or us, it was about him, feeling trapped in a life that revolved around my ambitions, around my relentless pursuit of perfection. I laughed at first, bitterly, thinking it was absurd, but deep down, I knew he was right. I had allowed my work, my career, to become the axis around which our entire lives spun. I had promised myself that nothing would interfere with my dream, and in that promise, I had neglected the people who loved me most. The next few weeks were a blur of moving boxes, legal consultations, and sleepless nights. I realized that the more I achieved professionally, the more my personal life unraveled. Friends stopped calling. My sister, who used to drop by every week with her kids, suddenly didn't have time. Birthdays, holidays, moments that should have been joyful turned into logistical challenges I barely noticed, buried as I was under spreadsheets, deadlines, and corporate calls. It was as if the world around me had quietly started to dissolve, leaving only the shiny, polished shell of a life I thought I wanted. And yet, the worst was still coming. One evening, I received a message from my son's wife, a simple, innocuous text that made my stomach drop. "We got married last month. I hope you're okay with this." My son, my only child, had married without telling me, without even a conversation. I stared at my phone, numb, as though the world around me suddenly became unreal, as though I had been pushed out of a reality I had believed in for decades. When I confronted him, he said he didn't think I would approve, not with how distant I had been, not with how consumed I seemed about my work. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. Absolutely. Let's continue with part 2, maintaining the same first-person, emotionally immersive, reflective style, pacing, and voice. The days that followed the revelations felt almost surreal. I would wake up in the morning, and for a few brief seconds, it would feel like everything was normal. But then I'd look around, at the quiet, at the empty spaces in our home, and remember that our dream life was only a facade. Ryan had moved out temporarily to stay with a friend, leaving the house eerily silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. I kept thinking I could make it right with a single conversation, a single gesture. But the reality was far more complicated. Trust, once fractured, cannot be rebuilt with words alone. I began spending time alone in the house, reflecting on what had brought us to this point. I realized that my obsession with success had gradually eroded the intimacy that once defined our marriage. I would come home late, exhausted, expecting Ryan to be understanding, and when he wasn't, I would become defensive. Every disagreement, every small argument had been allowed to fester into resentment, unspoken but palpable. And while I thought I was building a life of achievement and security, I had actually been building walls around myself, walls that kept out the people I loved the most. One afternoon, I found an old photo album tucked away in the back of a closet. Flipping through it, I saw pictures of our family in happier times. There were candid shots of Ryan laughing with our son, birthday parties where the house was messy with balloons and cake crumbs, vacations where we were so completely present that the world outside ceased to exist. I traced my fingers over the faces in the photos, feeling a sharp pang of guilt. Those were the moments I had sacrificed in the name of ambition, and now no amount of money, no career milestone could ever bring them back. It was during these reflections that I realized something else. My obsession with success hadn't just affected my family, it had changed me. I had become someone I barely recognized, someone who prioritized achievements over affection, performance over presence. I thought I was strong, unstoppable, a woman who could conquer anything. But in reality, I had been fragile in the most important areas of life. Fragile in ways I hadn't allowed myself to admit until everything began to fall apart. I reached out to Ryan again after a week of tense silence. Our conversation was awkward at first. He spoke carefully, measuring his words, while I struggled to articulate the remorse I felt without sounding defensive or insincere. He told me that he had felt invisible for a long time, that he had tried to speak up and hadn't been heard. Listening to him, I felt a mixture of shame and heartbreak. How had I allowed someone I loved so deeply to feel invisible while I pursued a dream that now felt increasingly hollow? Over time, our conversations began to deepen. We shared memories, but also our fears, our frustrations, and our regrets. Ryan told me about the nights he spent lying awake, wondering if our marriage could survive, if our family could be repaired. I told him about the pressures I had felt, the need to succeed, to prove myself. And slowly, carefully, we started to understand each other again. It was not immediate, it was not perfect, but it was real. And in that reality, I began to see the first glimmer of hope. Reconnecting with my son was harder. His resentment ran deep, and rightfully so. He had felt abandoned, neglected, and he had made choices that were independent of my approval because in his mind, I had been absent for too long. Our initial attempts at conversation ended in silence or frustration, but over time, with patience and humility, I began to demonstrate my commitment to rebuilding our bond. Small gestures mattered. Attending his favorite sporting events, sitting with him for hours discussing things that weren't about work or obligations, acknowledging the moments I had missed, and expressing a desire to be present moving forward. Even as I worked on these personal relationships, I had to confront the professional world I had built so meticulously. I realized that my dream career had contributed to my isolation, and I needed to redefine what success meant for me. I started delegating responsibilities, trusting colleagues more, and allowing myself moments of rest and reflection that I had previously dismissed as inefficiency. These changes were subtle at first, almost imperceptible to the outside world, but to me they were profound. I was learning that a life worth living is not measured in accolades, promotions, or appearances. It is measured in connection, in presence, in the quiet moments that make up the true texture of life. One day, while cleaning the attic, I came across a box labeled with my son's childhood drawings and school projects. Each one was a reminder of how quickly time passes and how much I had missed while chasing a version of success that now felt increasingly meaningless. I spent hours going through the box, holding his crayon drawings in my hands, tears streaming down my face. I realized then that while some moments are lost forever, others can still be reclaimed if we are willing to put in the effort to be present, to listen, and to love fully. I also began to journal regularly, documenting the journey of rebuilding my life, both personally and professionally. Writing became a mirror for reflection, a tool to process complex emotions, and a way to track the incremental progress I was making. Through journaling, I could revisit painful memories without judgment, acknowledge the growth I was experiencing, and reinforce the lessons I was learning. It was a reminder that transformation is gradual, often invisible, yet profoundly real. One evening, as I sat with Ryan on the porch watching the sunset, I realized how far we had come. The air was filled with the kind of quiet intimacy that only emerges from shared vulnerability, from struggles faced together, from lessons learned the hard way. I understood that our lives would never be the same as they were before the fractures, but they could be different in a meaningful, healthier way. And in that realization, I felt a sense of gratitude so deep it almost overwhelmed me. I had lost, I had faltered, I had been blind to the cost of my ambition, but I had also learned, grown, and reclaimed what mattered most. The journey was far from over, and there were still challenges ahead, but I now had the tools, the awareness, and the intention to navigate them with honesty and love. The dream I had pursued so single-mindedly taught me an unexpected lesson. Success without connection is an illusion, and no achievement can replace the human bonds that sustain us through life's trials. Rebuilding my life after that period of revelation wasn't linear. Some days felt full of progress, while others seemed like a step backward. I realized that repairing relationships wasn't about grand gestures. It was about showing up consistently, being present in ways I hadn't been before. Even small moments carried weight. A shared cup of coffee in the morning with Ryan, a simple text to my son asking how his day went, a quiet evening spent reminiscing about old family traditions. All of these were acts of reconstruction, thread by thread, weaving a fragile but genuine connection back into our lives. One morning, I found myself reflecting on how isolated I had truly become. For years, I had been so focused on appearing successful that I stopped nurturing friendships outside my immediate family. I had colleagues I barely knew outside of work, and friends who drifted away because I rarely made the effort to show up for them. I had been so immersed in the pursuit of my career, so obsessed with climbing higher, that I neglected the emotional capital that sustains life. It hit me hard. I had been wealthy in achievement, but impoverished in love, in companionship, in presence. I decided to reach out to an old friend, someone who had been a part of my life long before the corporate titles and accolades. The conversation was awkward at first. Years of distance create an invisible barrier. But slowly, over a few hours of genuine dialogue, the warmth of familiarity returned. She reminded me that life isn't about perfection or prestige. It's about being human, about sharing experiences, laughter, failures, and triumphs with people who see you for who you are, not what you accomplish. That realization became a cornerstone for the next stage of rebuilding my life, prioritizing authenticity over appearance. At home, Ryan and I faced challenges that were not easy to navigate. Old habits die hard. I would sometimes slip into the mindset of work first, ambition first, forgetting that the house I returned to at night was not just a space to rest, but a home that needed care, attention, and nurturing. Ryan would gently remind me, sometimes with humor, sometimes with quiet frustration, that our marriage required presence, not just conversation. I began to understand that healing is as much about action as it is about reflection. Words of apology matter, but consistent, visible change matters more. Reconnecting with my son was another delicate journey. He had lived for months feeling unseen and unheard. Initially, every attempt at bonding was met with polite resistance or silent tension, but I learned to listen, truly listen, without inserting my own explanations or defenses. I listened to his feelings, his disappointments, and his unspoken questions. I acknowledged the ways I had failed him, owning my mistakes without trying to justify them. Slowly, he began to open up. We started sharing small routines together, watching a TV show he loved, working on a weekend DIY project, even cooking a simple meal together. Each interaction was a thread, mending a tapestry that had frayed, and while some patches were still delicate, the overall fabric was starting to feel whole again. Work continued to demand my attention, but I started redefining my relationship with it. I realized that my obsession with perfection and the ideal career had been a double-edged sword. Yes, it had brought recognition, financial security, and prestige, but it had also isolated me, blinded me, and distorted my understanding of what a meaningful life really entails. I began delegating more, trusting colleagues to take responsibility, and allowing myself the freedom to step back from the constant pressure of appearing perfect. In doing so, I discovered a profound relief. My value was not tied solely to outcomes, titles, or numbers. It was tied to who I was as a person and how I connected with others. There was a moment, a turning point, that I will never forget. Ryan and I had planned a small dinner together at home, something intimate, just the two of us. As we sat across from each other, sharing food and laughter, I realized how rare and precious these simple moments had become. There was no need to impress, no need to perform, no need to keep up appearances. It was just us, present and real, sharing life in its raw, unfiltered form. That night, I understood the full weight of what I had lost and simultaneously the power I had to reclaim it. Through these experiences, I began to journal more intentionally. Writing became not just a reflective tool, but a therapeutic one. I chronicled my feelings, my mistakes, my triumphs, and the subtle victories in everyday life. I reflected on the ways my ambition had warped my priorities and how much of my identity had been tied to external validation rather than internal fulfillment. Each entry reminded me that growth is not a single moment, but a continuous journey, a series of choices to act differently than we have in the past. I also began to notice subtle shifts in how I interacted with others outside my immediate family. Colleagues, acquaintances, and even strangers responded differently when I engaged with them authentically rather than through a lens of performance. I realized that relationships are reciprocal. When we bring vulnerability and sincerity, people respond in kind. I began volunteering at a local community center, not for recognition, but to reconnect with a sense of purpose beyond personal achievement. That engagement grounded me, reminding me that life's meaning extends far beyond professional success or material gain. Despite these efforts, there were days of doubt, days when the weight of past mistakes threatened to overwhelm me. I would catch myself slipping back into old patterns, checking emails obsessively, prioritizing work over personal connections, or trying to control situations beyond my influence. On those days, I reminded myself that change is never linear, that setbacks are part of the process, and forgiveness, both of oneself and of others, is essential. I learned to breathe, to pause, to recalibrate, and to recommit to presence, authenticity, and connection. One particularly poignant moment came when my son invited me to his apartment to meet his wife properly. I had been hesitant for months, unsure of how to navigate the awkwardness and past resentment, but I accepted, determined to engage with openness rather than defensiveness. Sitting across from her, I felt the tension slowly dissolve. Conversation flowed, laughter emerged, and for the first time I felt included in their lives rather than an outsider observing from a distance. It was a reminder that relationships, even those strained to their breaking point, can be nurtured back to life with patience, humility, and genuine effort. I also realized that part of rebuilding required letting go of control. My obsession with being perfect, with orchestrating outcomes, had caused so much damage. To heal, I had to accept that I could not control every situation, every relationship, or every emotion. I could influence, guide, and participate, but I had to release the illusion that my efforts alone could guarantee success or happiness. That acceptance was liberating. It allowed me to experience life fully, with all its uncertainties and imperfections, without being consumed by fear or regret. As the months progressed, the small victories accumulated into meaningful change. Ryan and I began planning trips together, not extravagant vacations, but simple getaways that allowed us to reconnect away from the pressures of work. My son and I continued building routines that strengthened our bond. Friends returned, old connections were revived, and new relationships formed, grounded in authenticity rather than pretense. And I began to understand that the life I once chased, a life defined by accolades and external validation, had been incomplete. The life I was now creating was imperfect, messy, and deeply human, but it was richer, fuller, and far more rewarding. Looking back, I realized that the dream life I once believed in was always a mirage. It looked perfect from the outside, but was hollow at its core. The reality is that no achievement, no status, no material comfort can replace genuine human connection. Ambition without balance, without presence, comes at a steep price, a price I had paid fully and painfully. And yet, through that painful reckoning, I discovered the true measure of life: love, presence, authenticity, and the courage to change. By the time a year had passed, I could feel the transformation in myself. I was no longer the woman who equated her worth with achievement alone. I was more patient, more present, more intentional with my time and energy. I approached work with diligence but without obsession. I nurtured relationships with care and humility, and I valued authenticity over appearances. Most importantly, I had learned that life's greatest rewards often come not from accomplishments or accolades, but from the quiet, consistent cultivation of love, trust, and connection. And while I knew there would still be challenges ahead, I felt equipped to face them with a sense of grounded awareness and emotional resilience I had never possessed before. My journey had taught me that the unseen costs of ambition are real. As the second year after those upheavals began, I started noticing subtler signs of healing, moments that, at first, seemed almost ordinary, but carried extraordinary weight. I woke one morning to the smell of fresh coffee brewing, and Ryan had left a small note by my cup. "I'm glad we're still here." It was a simple gesture, almost insignificant on paper, but it made me realize how far we had come. We were no longer strangers in our own home. There was laughter again, quiet companionship, and an unspoken understanding that we were actively choosing each other every day, despite the scars we carried. Work, which had once consumed me entirely, began to feel different too. I no longer saw it as a proving ground, a measure of my worth. Instead, I treated it as a component of life, not the center of it. I delegated more confidently, trusting my team, which freed me to focus on what truly mattered outside of the office. For the first time in years, I could leave work behind at the end of the day without guilt, and the relief was intoxicating. In that space, I discovered hobbies I had long abandoned: painting, walking along the river near my home, and even cooking meals from scratch. These activities didn't offer recognition or accolades. They offered something deeper: presence, mindfulness, and joy in the simplest forms. My relationship with my son continued to grow, though it remained delicate at times. He was cautious, as he had every right to be, and I learned to respect his boundaries. I began showing up not just as a parent, but as a person interested in his life, listening to his stories, supporting his passions, and sharing in both triumphs and failures without judgment. One afternoon, he invited me to help him move into his new apartment. As we carried boxes together, I noticed the subtle ways we had reconnected: laughter shared over broken packing tape, stories exchanged about his childhood, even a quiet moment where he paused, smiled at me, and said, "I'm glad you're here." It was a small phrase, but it carried a depth of meaning I hadn't realized I craved so intensely. Through this period, I also confronted another difficult truth. Not everyone I had considered close would remain in my life. Some friends had drifted irreversibly, unable or unwilling to bridge the gap that my absence had created. Accepting this was painful, yet necessary. I had to acknowledge that relationships, like all things, are dynamic. Some were meant to endure, others were temporary, and the challenge was learning to treasure the ones that endured while letting go of resentment for the ones that didn't. I became intentional in cultivating new connections. I sought friendships with people who valued authenticity, who encouraged vulnerability, and who shared a willingness to support one another beyond superficial appearances. These relationships were different. They weren't about status or performance. They were about genuine companionship, laughter, empathy, and shared experience. Through these bonds, I realized the extent to which my previous life had been skewed toward perfection and pretense at the expense of true human connection. Ryan and I began making rituals that reinforced our bond. Simple acts became symbols of our renewed commitment: Sunday walks together without our phones, cooking meals side by side, sitting in silence while listening to music we both loved. We also began therapy, individually and together, to process the emotional layers of our past conflicts. These sessions were uncomfortable and often emotionally draining, but they provided insight into patterns we had unconsciously perpetuated for years. I learned that communication isn't just about speaking, it's about listening, reflecting, and responding with empathy rather than defensiveness. A pivotal moment came one rainy afternoon when we decided to clean out the garage. It was tedious, exhausting, and dusty, but while sorting through boxes, I stumbled upon old letters Ryan had written me over the years. Each one revealed his love, his frustrations, and his silent hope that we could weather the storms together. Reading them, I was overcome with both sorrow and gratitude. I realized how much he had endured quietly, how much patience and resilience had gone unnoticed. That day, I promised myself that I would never again allow ambition to blind me to the needs of those I loved. In parallel, I continued to reflect on my personal growth. I noticed shifts in my thought patterns. I was less judgmental of myself, more patient with my limitations, and more accepting of life's unpredictability. I began meditating in the mornings, focusing on gratitude and presence rather than planning every aspect of my day with obsessive precision. These small practices nurtured a sense of balance, grounding me in a reality that was messy but meaningful. I realized that life's richness isn't in perfection, it's in the authenticity of experience. Another profound lesson came through a community initiative I became involved with. Volunteering at a local shelter, I encountered people whose struggles were vastly different from my own, yet in their stories, I saw echoes of universal human experiences: loss, resilience, love, and hope. Listening to their narratives reminded me of the fragility of life and the importance of presence, compassion, and humility. I found myself both giving and receiving in ways I hadn't anticipated. The act of service grounded me, providing perspective on what truly matters and reinforcing the values I was striving to live by. My son's marriage also evolved in a way that surprised me. I had expected friction or guardedness, yet over time a tentative bond formed. I made it a point to ask for her advice on small matters, to show genuine interest in her life, and to respect her space. Slowly, she became a trusted part of our family network. These small acts of inclusion were crucial. They allowed us to rebuild trust and expand the circle of connection rather than retreating into old patterns of isolation. Through all these developments, I began to internalize a profound truth. Success and happiness are not synonymous. The accolades I once coveted, the promotions I chased with relentless energy, offered fleeting satisfaction at best. True fulfillment arises from love, connection, and presence, qualities I had long neglected. I began measuring my days differently, not by what I achieved professionally, but by the moments I engaged authentically with others, the laughter I shared, the acts of kindness I offered, and the ways I nurtured the people who mattered most. There were setbacks, of course, moments when old habits resurfaced, when I slipped into perfectionist tendencies, when impatience or frustration clouded my judgment. But instead of succumbing, I learned to pause, reflect, and course correct. I journaled these moments as well, documenting not just my successes, but my failures, recognizing that growth is iterative and that self-compassion is as important as discipline. I began to understand that embracing imperfection doesn't mean abandoning ambition. It means aligning ambition with values, ensuring that the pursuit of success does not come at the cost of integrity, connection, and emotional well-being. One particularly meaningful evening, Ryan and I hosted a small dinner with a few close friends who had remained steadfast throughout the turmoil. Conversation flowed easily, laughter was abundant, and the warmth of connection filled the room. Watching my family and friends interact, seeing joy and genuine engagement, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. I understood that this was the life I had been searching for all along, not the polished, curated version I had imagined, but a life rich in presence, resilience, and human connection. Through all these reflections, I also came to terms with my own personal limitations. I acknowledged that I had once been blind, ambitious to a fault, and at times selfish. Accepting responsibility for the ways I had hurt those I loved was painful, yet liberating. It allowed me to approach life with honesty and humility, to rebuild relationships on a foundation of truth rather than pretense. I learned that accountability is not just about apology, it is about consistent action, reflection, and growth. As the seasons changed, I noticed an internal shift in how I experienced time. I no longer rushed through moments, trying to tick off accomplishments or plan the next step. Instead, I savored experiences, allowed myself to be fully present, and appreciated the subtle beauty of everyday life. I realized that ambition is not inherently harmful, it's the imbalance and obsession with appearances that creates suffering. By aligning my drive with values that honored relationships, presence, and authenticity, I discovered a more sustainable, rewarding form of ambition. In quiet reflection, I often thought back to the darkest days, the moment I discovered our home had been sold, my son marrying without my knowledge, and the months of silence and tension that followed. I realized those experiences, as painful as they were, had catalyzed a profound transformation. I had been forced to confront. By the time the third year rolled around, life had begun to feel less like a series of crises and more like a delicate, ongoing process of rebuilding. The tension that had once hung over our home like a thick fog had started to lift, replaced by a tentative calm. Yet calm didn't mean complacency. I knew better than to think that the damage of the past could ever be erased completely. The cracks in trust, the scars of neglect, the months of absence in both heart and presence, they all lingered. But I had learned to approach them with patience, understanding that healing is not about erasing the past, but about coexisting with it while choosing a different path forward. One afternoon, Ryan suggested we take a small trip, just the two of us. Not a luxurious vacation, just a weekend away to reconnect. I was hesitant at first. My mind immediately ran through work deadlines, pending emails, and meetings I couldn't afford to miss. But something inside me whispered that these moments, not work, were what truly mattered. So I agreed. We drove to a small cabin by the lake, the road winding through autumn-colored trees that seemed to reflect the quiet transformation happening within me. The trip was unremarkable in its simplicity, yet it felt extraordinary. We cooked together, sat by the fireplace, talked about memories, hopes, and fears, conversations that had been absent for far too long. Returning home, I felt a renewed sense of clarity. I began to understand that my previous definition of dream life had been flawed. It was defined by outward markers of success, titles, money, recognition, rather than by the intangible elements that truly sustain happiness: love, presence, authenticity, and shared experience. I realized that my relentless ambition had created a life that looked perfect but felt hollow. Now I was learning to create a life that might not impress the world, but nurtured the people I loved, and that in itself was invaluable. My son and I continued to rebuild our relationship, slowly but steadily. He began inviting me to more aspects of his life, sharing his daily routines, his friends, and even his challenges. I made a conscious effort not to judge, to listen more than I spoke, and to respect his choices without attempting to control them. One evening, he came home visibly frustrated after a disagreement with his wife. Instead of trying to offer solutions immediately, I simply sat with him, letting him vent and expressing empathy. It was a subtle shift, but he noticed. In time, he began to share more openly, and I began to feel the deep satisfaction of connection that I had long missed. In my professional life, the transformation was equally profound. I had always equated success with exhaustive control and relentless output. Now I was learning to measure it differently, not by the hours I worked or the accolades I received, but by the balance I maintained and the relationships I nurtured along the way. I started mentoring younger colleagues, not to assert authority, but to share insights and guide them in navigating the pressures I had once succumbed to. This act of giving back brought a new sense of purpose, reminding me that achievement is only meaningful when it can be shared or leveraged to uplift others. Even the smallest moments began to carry weight. A quiet morning spent reading with Ryan, watching the sunrise from our balcony, felt like a victory. A casual lunch with my son that ended in laughter over trivial jokes felt like a triumph. These moments, which I had previously overlooked in my obsessive pursuit of career milestones, became the markers of true success. They were reminders that life's most meaningful accomplishments are often intangible and cannot be measured on a resume or balance sheet. Yet, the journey wasn't without setbacks. Old insecurities resurfaced, and I occasionally found myself slipping back into perfectionist tendencies. I would overcommit, overanalyze, or focus too intensely on control. When this happened, I learned to pause, to reflect, and to recalibrate. I reminded myself that growth is iterative and nonlinear, that self-compassion is as critical as accountability, and that acknowledging mistakes does not diminish progress, it enriches it. One particularly difficult moment arose when a close colleague, someone I had trusted deeply, expressed disappointment over a decision I had made in the office. My initial reaction was defensive. I felt a pang of old habits, the instinct to justify and prove myself. But instead, I paused. I listened. I acknowledged their perspective without deflection. The conversation was uncomfortable, but honest, and by the end, our mutual respect had deepened. It was a clear demonstration that the lessons I had learned in personal relationships were applicable in every area of life. Presence, empathy, and authenticity matter more than control, pride, or appearances. Family gatherings became more intentional. For the first time in years, I hosted a small holiday dinner, inviting both old friends and family members who had remained connected despite past neglect. I approached the event differently, not as a performance, not as a showcase of perfection, but as an opportunity for genuine connection. The evening was imperfect, plates were slightly mismatched, a dish was overcooked, but it was filled with laughter, warmth, and conversation. For the first time in a long while, I felt fully present, fully alive, and fully part of a network of people that mattered to me. Through all of this, I also had to confront my own internal narrative about ambition. I realized that my drive was inherently negative. It was the imbalance and obsession with appearances that it caused harm. I began redefining what ambition meant to me. It could coexist with love, presence, and authenticity. I could pursue goals, build a career, and strive for excellence, but not at the expense of the people that mattered most. This shift in perspective transformed the way I approached challenges, allowing me to work with energy and passion without sacrificing balance or empathy. One of the most profound realizations came in quiet reflection during a rainy evening at home. I was sitting by the window, watching droplets slide down the glass, thinking about the past years, the mistakes, the betrayals, the lessons learned. I understood that the cost of my dream life had been high, fractured relationships, lost time, and emotional distance. But I also understood that these experiences had forced me to grow, to see clearly what truly matters, and to take deliberate steps towards living a life aligned with values rather than appearances. The pain, while deep, had catalyzed transformation. I also began to focus on small rituals of gratitude. Each morning, I wrote down 3 things I appreciated, whether it was Ryan laughing at an old joke, my son sharing a small victory, or a quiet moment of solitude. This practice shifted my mindset from scarcity to abundance, from regret to recognition of the present moment's richness. I realized that while ambition and achievement are part of life, they are not sufficient for fulfillment. Truthful contentment comes from appreciating what we have, nurturing relationships, and participating fully in life's fleeting, beautiful moments. Slowly, my life started to feel cohesive again. The tension that had defined my home, the sense of disconnection with my son, the void I had once felt in friendships, they were not erased, but they had softened. The walls I had built around myself and my ambitions were dismantled, replaced by bridges of trust, communication, and understanding. And in this gradual reconstruction, I discovered a deep sense of peace I had never known before, a peace not rooted in perfection or external validation, but in presence, authenticity, and the intentional cultivation of connection. By the end of that year, I could see tangible evidence of transformation in every corner of my life. Ryan and I had reestablished intimacy and trust, not without effort or challenge, but in ways that were sustainable and genuine. My son and I had found a rhythm of connection, a foundation built on honesty, patience, and mutual respect. Friendships had been rekindled and new ones formed, not on superficiality, but on shared values and authenticity. And I had come to understand that the dream life I once chased so relentlessly had never truly been about perfection. It had always been about alignment with what is most meaningful. By the time the fourth year arrived, I realized that life's lessons were no longer abstract. They had become part of who I was. The daily practice of presence, empathy, and authenticity had reshaped my perspective, not just on relationships, but on ambition and success itself. I understood that while achievements are fleeting, connection endures, and the care we put into nurturing others defines the true measure of a meaningful life. This awareness brought both peace and a sense of responsibility. I couldn't undo the mistakes of the past, but I could continue to choose a different path moving forward. Ryan and I had grown closer than I thought possible after all the fractures in our marriage. One evening, we sat together on the porch, sharing a quiet cup of tea as the sky darkened and stars began to emerge. No words were necessary at first, just being present with one another felt profound. Then he spoke softly about the moments when he had considered leaving, the nights he felt invisible, and the quiet despair that had settled into our home. Listening to him, I felt the full weight of the pain I had caused, but also a deep gratitude that he had chosen to stay, to rebuild, and to forgive. I realized that forgiveness is not about erasing the past. It is about choosing to move forward, even when the memory of betrayal lingers. Our son had continued to test my patience and my humility, as he rightly should have. His trust had been broken, and rebuilding it required consistent effort, not just words. I found that listening without judgment, offering guidance without imposing control, and celebrating his autonomy became the foundation of our renewed bond. I began to see the joy in being present, in watching him make decisions, succeed, or even fail, knowing that I was there to support him, not as a controlling parent, but as someone who loved unconditionally. One pivotal moment came when he asked me to attend a small gathering with his wife and a few of their friends. Initially, I hesitated. Memories of the past, of being excluded from his life, still stung. But I agreed, reminding myself that presence, even in discomfort, was essential. That evening was transformative. Laughter flowed freely, and I felt the first real sense of being part of their world, not as an observer, but as a participant. We shared stories, jokes, and quiet moments of connection that once seemed impossible. It was a reminder that relationships, though fragile, can be nurtured back to life when effort and intention are present. Professionally, I had begun redefining my own goals. No longer driven solely by status or recognition, I focused on work that aligned with my values, work that contributed positively to others' lives. I mentored young colleagues, not for accolades, but to help them navigate challenges I had once faced blindly. The satisfaction I derived from this was deeper than any promotion or bonus I had previously coveted. I realized that true fulfillment comes not from outward validation, but from meaningful engagement and impact. I also began reflecting on my personal growth in ways I hadn't before. I journaled daily, recording both achievements and missteps. Writing allowed me to observe patterns, recognize progress, and acknowledge areas for continued improvement. It was humbling to see how much I had changed, yet also how much work remained. The act of writing became both a mirror and a compass, guiding me toward choices that honored my values rather than external expectations. Some days were still difficult. Old habits resurfaced, impulses to overwork, to prioritize image over substance, to control situations beyond my influence. But now I could recognize these tendencies and redirect my energy. I learned to pause before reacting, to breathe before responding, and to choose presence over perfection. This mindfulness transformed my interactions not just with family, but with everyone I encountered. People responded to me differently. There was less defensiveness, less performance, and more authenticity. In return, I felt more connected, more grounded, and more at peace. I also began noticing changes in Ryan. He was softer, more open, and more willing to share his fears and feelings. I realized that our healing had been mutual. Both of us had been shaped by the pain. Both of us had learned to approach life with humility, patience, and intentionality. Watching him grow alongside me, witnessing his own transformation, gave me hope that we could continue building a life together that was resilient, authentic, and deeply connected. One afternoon, as we were organizing the basement, I stumbled upon old mementos of our son's childhood, his first school report, drawings, small trophies from soccer games. Holding these objects, I felt a mixture of nostalgia and sorrow. I had missed so many moments while chasing my own ambitions, but I also felt a renewed determination to be present now, to treasure the moments still ahead, and to engage fully in my son's life without letting the past define our relationship. It was a quiet revelation. Life is not about perfection, but about presence, connection, and intention. Through these experiences, I also became more attuned to the broader community around me. I volunteered at local events, participated in neighborhood initiatives, and engaged in acts of service that were purely about giving rather than recognition. These activities grounded me in a sense of shared humanity and reminded me that the life I had once pursued in isolation was incomplete. True fulfillment comes not just from personal success, but from contributing to the well-being of others, from nurturing connections that extend beyond immediate family or professional circles. Despite the progress, I occasionally confronted the harsh reality that some relationships might never fully heal. Friends who had drifted away, acquaintances who had felt neglected. Accepting these losses was challenging but necessary. I learned to differentiate between relationships that could be nurtured and those that were beyond repair. This discernment was difficult, yet liberating. I realized that my energy was finite and that focusing on connections that mattered most was not selfish, but essential for sustainable growth and emotional well-being. In my moments of reflection, I often revisited the darkest periods of the past, discovering our home had been sold without my knowledge, my son marrying without my involvement, months of silence and tension that had felt unbearable. I acknowledged the pain, the regret, and the consequences of my past choices, yet I also recognized the profound lessons embedded within those experiences. They had forced me to confront uncomfortable truths, to grow in ways I would not have chosen voluntarily, and to embrace a life that prioritizes authenticity, empathy, and connection over appearance and achievement. Ryan and I continued our small rituals of intimacy and connection, Sunday walks, shared meals, quiet evenings spent talking or simply being present. Each ritual reinforced our bond, reminding us that the work of a relationship is continuous, deliberate, and active. I realized that love, like ambition, requires effort, but unlike ambition, the rewards of love are enduring and deeply transformative. At home, I also began creating spaces for reflection and mindfulness. Small corners of the house were transformed into areas where I could journal, meditate, or simply sit in quiet contemplation. These spaces became sacred in their simplicity, offering refuge from the noise of daily life and the pressures of work. They reminded me that balance is not a luxury, but a necessity for emotional and spiritual well-being. As the year progressed, I found a rhythm that was sustainable, fulfilling, and deeply human. The life I had rebuilt was imperfect, messy, and nuanced, but it was also rich, meaningful, and authentic. I had learned to navigate setbacks with patience, to embrace vulnerability without fear, and to prioritize relationships over performance. I understood that ambition is not inherently destructive, but that imbalance and obsession can carry profound costs. By integrating presence, empathy, and intentionality into every aspect of life, I discovered a version of success that was sustainable, authentic, and deeply satisfying. The most powerful realization, however, came during an ordinary evening when Ryan, our son, and I were simply sitting together in the living room. We weren't celebrating anything. There were no grand gestures or elaborate plans. We were just together. And in that quiet, unassuming moment, I felt a sense of gratitude that surpassed anything I had experienced during the years I had chased external markers of achievement. I understood then that life's greatest treasures are not trophies, accolades, or recognition. They are connection, presence, love, and shared experience. I began journaling this insight, capturing the journey in its entirety, the mistakes, the regrets, the lessons learned, and the moments of genuine connection that had reshaped my life. Writing these reflections reinforced my commitment to live with intention, to engage authentically, and to prioritize relationships over appearances. I realized that while ambition can motivate and inspire, it must be balanced with empathy, presence, and emotional awareness to prevent isolation, resentment, and regret. Before I begin, if you've ever felt the weight of ambition at the expense of your relationships, or realized too late that success can come with a hidden cost, this part of my story is for you. The years of rebuilding had taught me patience, empathy, and the quiet power of presence. But even with these lessons, I understood that life doesn't reward perfection. It rewards persistence, honesty, and the courage to face one's own mistakes. I woke one morning, sipping my coffee, and I realized how different my life felt compared to the chaos of the past. It wasn't flawless, it wasn't curated for appearances, and it certainly wasn't the dream I had once chased blindly, but it was mine, and that made it infinitely more valuable. That morning, Ryan came in from the garden, brushing dirt from his hands, and smiled. "You've changed," he said simply, not in a judgmental way, but with a quiet acknowledgement that came from shared struggle and survival. I knew exactly what he meant. The woman he was speaking to was no longer the person who had obsessed over perfection and status, who had been blind to the needs of her family and friends. I had been humbled, broken, and reshaped by the consequences of my choices. And in that transformation, I had discovered what truly matters. Over breakfast, our son joined us, still groggy but smiling, holding a small journal. He told me he'd been keeping track of little victories at work and at home, things that made him proud. And in that moment, I realized how far we had come, not just in rebuilding our bond, but in cultivating a family culture of recognition, empathy, and presence. These were lessons I had never learned in school, in work, or even in my so-called successful life. They were learned in the crucible of failure and reflection, and they were far more valuable than any accolade I had once chased. I thought back to the moments that had hurt the most, discovering the house had been sold without my knowledge, learning of my son's marriage after the fact, months of silence and tension that made me feel invisible. Each of those moments had left scars, but they also forced me to confront truths I might otherwise have ignored. I had learned that ambition, when divorced from presence, carries an unseen cost, the erosion of trust, the loss of intimacy, and the quiet diminishment of joy. And yet, through the pain, I had also discovered resilience, humility, and the profound beauty of human connection. Ryan and I had continued our rituals of togetherness, small things that might seem trivial to an outsider, but which had become the glue of our relationship. Sunday walks, shared breakfasts, and evening talks without distraction. But even more than the routines, it was the quality of our presence that had changed. We had learned to listen without judgment, to speak without defensiveness, and to offer support without expectation. These practices, repeated day after day, had transformed not only our marriage, but the atmosphere of our entire home. Our son, too, had grown into someone I could be proud of, not just because of his achievements, but because of the man he was becoming, thoughtful, empathetic, and intentional in his relationships. I realized that my greatest impact as a parent wasn't about controlling outcomes or orchestrating his path. It was about showing up consistently, offering guidance without imposition, and creating space for him to learn, grow, and trust. That, I realized, was the true definition of love. In quiet moments, I reflected on the ways my own behavior had shaped the past. I had been consumed by the illusion of control, by the need to prove myself, by the obsession with appearing perfect. I had believed that success could shield me from pain, neglect, and loneliness. But life had shown me that no amount of money, prestige, or achievement can replace presence, empathy, and love. Those elements, the unseen currency of human experience, are what sustain a life, and they are far more precious than any external accolade. I also learned that forgiveness, both given and received, is an ongoing process. Ryan, my son, and I had forgiven each other for past transgressions, but forgiveness is not a single act. It is a daily choice, a commitment to move forward despite the memory of past hurts. We acknowledged mistakes, discussed them openly, and made deliberate choices to engage differently moving forward. This practice, though sometimes uncomfortable, became the foundation of a family life that felt authentic, resilient, and deeply connected. Through the process, I began to notice the subtle, beautiful details of everyday life that I had once overlooked. The way sunlight filtered through the kitchen window in the morning, the sound of laughter drifting from the living room, the quiet intimacy of a shared meal. These ordinary moments, once invisible to me, now carried profound meaning. They reminded me that life's richness is not in grandeur or perfection, but in the accumulation of small, authentic experiences shared with those we love. I began journaling more intentionally than ever before, documenting not just milestones, but the nuances of daily life, the smiles, the minor victories, and the unexpected moments of connection. Each entry reinforced the understanding that fulfillment arises not from achieving the idealized life, but from embracing the real one, the messy, imperfect, but deeply human journey that we are living. My journals became a mirror, reflecting growth, resilience, and the enduring power of presence. One evening, as we sat together sharing dinner, I noticed Ryan and our son exchanging a joke, laughing freely. The scene was simple, yet it struck me with profound clarity. This was the life I had truly longed for all along, not accolades or perfect appearances, but connection, laughter, and shared presence. I felt a wave of gratitude, not for what I had achieved materially, but for the relationships I had nurtured, repaired, and strengthened. It was a feeling that transcended words, an understanding that life's true rewards are intangible, yet infinitely more enduring than any material gain. Through this journey, I also realized the broader lesson of my experience. The pursuit of a dream life, if defined solely by ambition or external validation, carries profound risk. It can blind us to the people around us, erode trust, and create distance in the very relationships that sustain us. Yet, if approached with intention, presence, and empathy, ambition can coexist with authenticity and love. The difference lies not in the goal itself, but in the way we navigate the path, the priorities we honor, and the relationships we choose to nurture along the way. I remember a quiet night when I sat on the porch alone, reflecting on all that had happened. The air was cool, the sky was clear, and the stars shone brightly above. I felt a profound sense of peace, a recognition that I had faced the consequences of my choices, confronted my failures, and rebuilt a life that aligned with my values. I understood that life would continue to challenge me, that setbacks would occur, and that the work of presence, empathy, and authenticity is never complete. But I also knew that I was equipped to face these challenges with intention, humility, and courage. Looking back on the years, I realized that the unseen cost of my previous dream life was steep, yet invaluable. The fractured relationships, lost time, and emotional distance had forced me to examine my priorities, to confront my flaws, and to embrace growth. I had learned that the pursuit of external validation is never sufficient, and that the richness of life is measured not by accolades, possessions, or appearances, but by the depth of connection, the quality of presence, and the authenticity of love. As the evening drew to a close, I joined Ryan and our son in the living room. We sat together quietly, without the need for words. There was comfort in shared presence, in the understanding that we had endured hardship, learned from mistakes, and arrived at a place of mutual trust and care. I felt the culmination of years of reflection, effort, and intentionality crystallize into a deep sense of gratitude. This, I realized, was the life worth living, imperfect, human, and fully engaged. In that moment, I understood that the story of my dream life was not about the pursuit of perfection or achievement. It was about awakening to what truly matters. It was about choosing presence over performance, connection over status, and love over ambition. It was about learning that the unseen costs of chasing an idealized vision of success can be devastating, yet the lessons embedded in those costs can lead to profound growth and transformation. I also recognized the responsibility that comes with such awareness. I am now committed to living deliberately, to nurturing relationships, to practicing empathy, and to embracing the ordinary moments that carry extraordinary meaning. I understand that life is fragile, unpredictable, and fleeting, and that our choices, daily and intentional, define the depth, richness, and authenticity of our experience. The years of rebuilding had taught me patience, humility, and a deeper understanding of what truly matters. Yet, even as life stabilized, I realized that healing is never complete. It is a continuous, deliberate process. One evening, I found myself sitting alone on the porch, watching the sun set over the horizon, reflecting on how much it changed. The house was quieter than it used to be in chaos, but it was filled with presence. Ryan in the kitchen preparing dinner, our son quietly working on his latest project, and even the small plants I had started nurturing throughout the home thriving under consistent care. It was a life that looked simple, almost ordinary, but it carried a depth I had never experienced before. Ryan came out to join me, carrying 2 cups of tea. We sat together in silence for a while, letting the warmth of the moment settle. Then, softly, he said, "I feel like we finally found our rhythm, even after everything." I looked at him and realized how profoundly true that was. We had survived the fractures of betrayal, the tension of silence, and the years of neglect that had grown between us. And yet, through deliberate effort, empathy, and love, we had found a way back to each other. The word rhythm resonated deeply. It implied continuity, balance, and the patient unfolding of life, rather than an abrupt, perfect resolution. Our son had grown in ways I had only dared hope for. Over time, he had allowed me into his life fully, sharing both his achievements and his struggles. One afternoon, he called me to share news about a professional milestone he had achieved. It was a small victory, but the pride in his voice was palpable. I congratulated him, letting him know that I recognized not just the achievement, but the effort, determination, and integrity behind it. Listening to him, I realized how much we had both grown. I had learned to listen and support without control, and he had learned to trust and include me again. During these years, I also became increasingly aware of my own emotional evolution. I was no longer reactive in the ways I had been in the past. I had developed an ability to pause, to reflect, and to respond thoughtfully rather than impulsively. Even disagreements with Ryan or our son became opportunities for understanding rather than conflict. I learned to hold space for their emotions, to accept their perspectives without defensiveness, and to communicate my own feelings honestly. This practice transformed not only my family dynamics, but also my interactions with colleagues, friends, and even strangers. Presence, I realized, was contagious. There were still moments of doubt and insecurity. Old habits would occasionally resurface, whispers of my former obsession with perfection or fear of inadequacy, but I learned to confront these thoughts with self-compassion rather than self-criticism. I reminded myself that growth is iterative, that resilience is built in the small, consistent choices we make daily, and that forgiveness, both of oneself and others, is essential. Each setback became a lesson, each misstep an opportunity to deepen my awareness and strengthen my intentionality. One particularly transformative experience came unexpectedly. Our son invited me and Ryan to join him on a short trip with friends. I had initially hesitated, unsure how to navigate the new dynamics, but I accepted, focusing on presence rather than anxiety. Over the weekend, I observed my son in his element, laughing, leading, and connecting authentically with others. I realized then how much time I had lost while pursuing my own ambitions and how critical it was to honor these moments now. By choosing to show up fully, I was building trust, sharing experiences, and creating memories that could not be taken away. It was a powerful reminder that presence is the ultimate gift we can offer to the people we love. Ryan and I also continued to cultivate rituals that reinforced our bond. Sunday mornings became sacred, quiet walks, shared breakfast, and reflective conversation. We celebrated small victories and supported each other through minor setbacks. Even disagreements were handled differently. Less defensiveness, more listening, more curiosity about the other's perspective. Through these practices, our marriage had transformed from a fragile, tension-filled connection into a resilient partnership built on mutual respect, understanding, and care. At home, I also made a conscious effort to create spaces for mindfulness and reflection. I set aside time each day to journal, meditate, or simply sit in quiet observation. These moments of stillness allowed me to process emotions, reflect on relationships, and maintain balance amidst life's inevitable challenges. I realized that emotional and spiritual well-being is not a luxury, but a necessity, and that neglecting it, as I had in the past, comes with profound costs. Professional life, too, had taken on a new shape. I continued to work diligently, but no longer at the expense of personal connections. I focused on mentoring, collaboration, and projects that aligned with my values rather than chasing prestige or appearances. The satisfaction I derived from work was no longer about external recognition, but about meaningful contribution and sustainable engagement. I realized that ambition is not inherently destructive. It becomes harmful only when divorced from balance, presence, and emotional awareness. Friendships also evolved during this period. Some had returned, stronger than before, while others remained distant, a natural consequence of past neglect. I learned to embrace the impermanence of relationships, to treasure those that endure, and to release resentment for those that do not. My energy was finite, and I understood that investing it wisely was critical for maintaining emotional health and authentic connection. Through all these experiences, I gradually internalized a profound truth. Life's true value is measured not by accomplishments, wealth, or recognition, but by connection, presence, and intentionality. The dream life I had once chased, perfect, impressive, externally validated, had come at an unseen cost: fractured relationships, lost time, and emotional distance. Yet within the same journey, I had discovered something far more enduring: the power of love, empathy, forgiveness, and authentic presence. These are the elements that make life rich, meaningful, and sustainable. There were moments when the past resurfaced unexpectedly, reminders of betrayal, miscommunication, and neglect. But instead of allowing them to define the present, I chose reflection over resentment, empathy over defensiveness, and learning over blame. I realized that our mistakes, as painful as they are, contain the seeds of wisdom and transformation. The fractures in my relationships, though challenging, became the catalysts for growth, both for myself and for those I loved. One quiet evening, I reflected on how far we had come. Ryan and I had rebuilt trust and intimacy. Our son and I had established a bond rooted in respect and authenticity, and friendships had been renewed or replaced by connections built on shared values. Even simple routines, the sound of laughter at the dinner table, the comfort of shared silence, the warmth of a gentle touch, felt profound in your ordinary presence. I understood then that the life I now lived was imperfect, yes, but it was fully mine. And in that ownership, I discovered a peace I had never known when chasing ambition for its own sake. Yet I also recognize that the work of presence, empathy, and authenticity is ongoing. Life is not a final destination, but a continuous journey of deliberate choices. Each interaction, each moment of listening, each act of care reinforces the bonds we hold most dear. I had learned that neglecting these elements, even for a short time, can erode trust and intimacy, but tending them consistently can build resilience and profound connection. I also began to notice a deeper sense of gratitude in everyday life. The mundane, morning coffee, shared meals, casual conversation became infused with meaning because I was fully present, fully aware, and fully engaged. Gratitude shifted my focus from scarcity and regret to abundance and recognition. I realized that fulfillment is not found in the extraordinary, but in the accumulation of small, authentic moments lived intentionally and shared with love. Through reflection, I understood that ambition is not the enemy. It is imbalance and obsession that carry risk. My past mistakes had taught me that achievement without presence can be hollow, but ambition integrated with empathy, mindfulness, and connection can be a powerful tool for both personal growth and meaningful impact. I had learned to recalibrate my priorities, to align my actions with my values, and to cultivate a life that honors both achievement and humanity. Looking back, I recognized that the journey had been painful, humbling, and transformative.